Alright, so the JRPG review video that I released back in December is like the best a video of mine has ever done, which is, you know, not saying a lot, but I still appreciate it nonetheless. And at the end of that video, I talked about how I wanted to do shorter review style videos throughout the year as opposed to the one really long one at the end of every year. And so that's what this is. I decided that I didn't want to do individual game reviews because that would be a lot of like frequent video making. Instead, I would just do monthly review videos where I compile reviews for all the games I've played that month. So this is the first of those. As you can see, it's a little bit late. It's not exactly January anymore, so I guess you can expect these to come out, you know, probably a couple weeks after the month is over, in all honesty. But we're doing it now, and here we are. I played 2 games back in January, and so without further ado, The Legend of Heroes Trails of Cold Steel 4 has all the same strengths and weaknesses as Cold Steel 3, but cranked up to 11 in both directions, right down to luring you into a false sense of security with an Act 1 that stands as one of the better parts of the series in isolation, but is held back by the slow-moving train wreck that follows it. Starting with the good things Cold Steel 4 lists from Cold Steel 3, the character moments are on point. Anytime a character starts monologuing, you know you're in for something good. The stars of Cold Steel 4 are definitely Yuna, Crow, and Cedric. Yuna slots right into the protagonist role during Act 1 so smoothly that she manages to stop the group dynamic from slacking in Reen's absence. Her speech to the old Class 7 motivating them to go rescue Reen was one of the game's major highlights. I was actually surprised we got Crow back. I probably shouldn't have been, considering how the Cold Steel arc follows every other major trope of the genre, so logically Crow's redemption wouldn't be any different, but what can I say? He spent most of Cold Steel 2 and 3 being adversarial, so I just figured he was going to stay that way. I'm glad he did return to the party though, because the resolution of his conflict with Reen was a long time coming, but was all the more satisfying for it. As for Cedric, he's a character I probably should have singled out for praise in my Cold Steel 3 review, so allow me to remedy that here. Cedric has been one of the most interesting characters to watch develop over the course of the Cold Steel arc, because his progression from bystander to full-on antagonist is shown to the player essentially in full, making him very easy to sympathize with despite the side he chooses to take. Unfortunately, the characters were my one point of praise for Cold Steel 3, and so it is also my one point of praise for Cold Steel 4. Remember how I thought Cold Steel 3 was bloated both lore and cast-wise, and how that brought down the game significantly in my regards? Yeah, it gets worse here. In Cold Steel 3, I was frustrated with the curse because it felt out of place with the pre-established lore. In retrospect, that was an objectively incorrect statement. Magic like that has been part of the series since the Crossbell arc. Cold Steel 4, however, provides me with a more valid reason to dislike it, namely in how it robs almost all of the antagonists of their agency, right down to the main antagonist of the arc and arguably the entire series up to this point, Chancellor Osborn. Turns out, he's actually a reincarnation of Emperor Dreykels, the mechanics of which is never explained, and is a loving family man. Personally, I thought Osborn was great as a pure evil, power-hungry villain, but this twist completely spits in the face of that by essentially saying that he can't be held accountable for his actions. Admittedly, they do say later that the curse only amplifies the malice that already exists within the people it affects, but it still makes them do things they would never do otherwise, so I'm calling your bluff, game. That was a bad writing decision. Then there's the matter of the narrative itself being way too bloated. It's never been a secret that the writers have at best a skeleton outline of the series' plot going forward, and that plot beats are inserted and changed as necessary, but by the end of the Cold Steel arc, the fact that these games are written one at a time becomes painfully obvious. I'm confident that if the writers planned the whole arc out in advance, the story could have been covered in 2 or 3 games instead of 4. So much time across the Cold Steel arc is spent either on field studies or doing glorified fetch quests to save kidnapped characters, both of which could have easily been cut down or axed entirely with a little more foresight. If you assume an average of 60 hours per game, that's 240 hours for the entire arc. There are definitely not 240 hours of necessary story content here, and if that's not bad enough, there's still more. A third of Reverie, at least as far as I'm aware, is devoted to wrapping up the Cold Steel arc. They've spent 4 full-length RPGs telling the story, and apparently it still isn't enough. Trails games can feel slow sometimes, but realizations like these are what really put the phrase Trails games are poorly paced into context. And of course, with a bloated plot comes a bloated cast. It's actually absurd getting full party shots in the middle of dungeons and seeing like 20 characters just standing there. It was during one of these full party shots when I was struck with the realization that Machias has not done anything since Cold Steel 1, but he's part of Class 7, so he has to be there. Then there are other characters like Duvali. Duvali, who has spent the last 3 games being absolutely insufferable, decides that she's had a change of heart in Cold Steel 4 and joins the party, only to be immediately backseated until the confrontation with Arian Road towards the end of the game. 30 plus playable characters sounds cool on paper, but the impracticality of it becomes obvious in execution. They didn't even have time to properly finish Reen's character arc. He's a self-sacrificing hero with low self-esteem to the bitter end. So that's it then. I've played through 4 Cold Steel games and spent the entire time complaining. Why do I like these games? That's not a facetious statement, I'm genuinely confused. I've said in the past that the series has a lot of potential, but out of the 9 games I've played so far, only 2 of them have really lived up to that potential. I come to these games for the writing, come out of each one saying it was poorly written, and then eagerly jump into the next one hoping that this time they'll finally get it right. Am I just a sucker for JRPG tropes? Or maybe I'm really just enamored with the idea of an overarching narrative. Maybe my real takeaway from the Cold Steel arc is that I'm allowed to like bad writing. I mean, I did enjoy the game. It never felt like a slog to get through or anything. It was just really easy to point and laugh at during some crucial moments, which is not something you really want from your grand fantasy epic. I might very well come back to these games in a couple of months and decide to knock all their ratings down a few pegs, but for now something in me is still enjoying them. Before I close, there were a couple smaller points I wanted to bring up. One, I've been doing most if not all of the side quests in each of these games since the Crossbell arc, and I have to say, Cold Steel 4 has one of the series' better batches. Especially during Act 3, a lot of them tie back into the lore or wrap up character subplots, which are always fun things to include in side content. 2, I have to say, the soundtracks of the series really fell off. The Sky arc and especially first chapter were littered with these bouncy jazz fusion tracks that were strong across the board. Then the Crossbell arc hit, and all of a sudden each game had like 1 or 2 memorable songs. Cold Steel 1 had at least a handful of songs to add to the playlist, but the rest were major letdowns. Third and finally, I made a comment in my Cold Steel 3 review about how I thought Cold Steel 4 was going to turn my opinion on Muse around, but unfortunately it didn't. They did give us the info dump they were teasing, but it wasn't anything particularly surprising, and her personality largely remained the same. She was just less mysterious. It's not a major point against the game, I just wanted to give a follow-up. I'm a little nervous going into Reverie. Of the Trails games currently available in the West, it's one of the 3 I see most consistently singled out for praise alongside Second Chapter and Azure. I've seen some fandom takes go as far as to say it ties up all of the loose ends from the Cold Steel arc to give it a more satisfying conclusion. I want to buy into the hype, but I also thought the aforementioned other 2 games were not among the series' best, so I don't know. I already have the game, so I'll probably jump right in just to see how this all ends, since I'm basically already there. I guess we'll have to wait and see. I feel at least a little bit bad for enjoying Papers, Please. Immigration, at least from my understanding, is nowhere near a fun process, and in nearly every other aspect of that game, that idea is captured well. From the drab color palette to the minimalist sound design, the game has an incredibly heavy atmosphere. But I can't help it. Cross-referencing increasing quantities of paperwork as your main gameplay mechanics should be tedious, but once you get a feel for how it works, you realize that there's a certain rhythm to it, and it actually becomes fun. Sort of on that note, but largely unrelated, I was hoping for more emphasis to be put on the actual people whose passports you're reviewing. There were a couple of exceptions. The characters related to the token side quests were all great, especially Yorji, who I was consistently rooting for to get his paperwork in order. But largely the game is lacking the sort of interpersonal moral dilemmas that its premise would otherwise indicate. In choosing to tackle broader strokes themes, it loses out on the potential to tell more emotionally compelling stories, which is what I think holds it back from being an all-timer for me in terms of narrative-driven indie games. Also, maybe this is a little petty, but I'm not sure why they bothered with including 20 different endings when there are really only 3.5 endings, and the rest are glorified fail states. It gives the impression that the player's choices are more impactful than they actually are. And just to wrap up this month's segment, I want to give a sort of off-the-cuff review of the DualSense. I've owned a PS5 for about a year now, and despite being like a pretty hardcore Nintendo fan, I have to say, the DualSense might be like the nicest controller I've ever used. I'm assuming if you're watching this video, you've probably held a DualShock before, like any of them. They're all like incredibly cheap feeling. Like I feel like I could snap a DualShock 4 in half. I know I couldn't, but like the plastic feels very like flimsy. It's very lightweight. The DualSense, it has like a really nice sort of heft to it. It gets rid of the weird shaping of the DualShock where like the circles with the buttons on it like jut out. And then the grips are kind of just awkwardly underneath it. Here it's all like nice and like flat. And it's just very comfortable in the hands. I think it's really cool how the circle button is like molded to fit the like slant of the controller. Like the other buttons are like flat, but the circle button kind of like it's on an incline because the rest of the controller is on an incline. And that's just like a nice little like comfort kind of detail, I guess. The only thing I don't really like about it is like the textured control sticks, but even then you kind of stop noticing it after a while. So just overall, I have to give props to Sony. Like this might be my favorite controller, you know. And that's it for this month's review segment. Here's the current list of all the games I've played this year and their ranking. I'll be showing this at the end of each monthly video to show both the new games and their positions, and also if like I've switched around any of the games I've talked about in previous videos. And yeah. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in March with the February video.